It is my pleasure, and I'm thrilled to introduce today's speaker, Tufts English Professor of the Practice, Emily Strasser. Professor Strasser actually joined Tufts only recently, about a year ago. And so I'm super happy that finally we get to formally and officially introduce her to the environmental studies community. Professor Strasser is a journalist and a creative nonfiction writer, and she's the author of the award-winning book, Half-Life of a Secret, which is a memoir where she confronts the legacy of her grandfather's work on developing nuclear weapons as part of the Manhattan Project. And her outstanding work on that book was recognized by the 2024 Reed Environmental Writing Award and the 2024 Minnesota Book Award. By the way, we are holding a raffle today. So if you are interested in getting a copy of Professor Strasser's book, CNET will be drawing 2 or 3 lucky numbers. So make sure you sign up on the paper sheet that is going around and put your name on it if you want to be considered for a copy. Her writing has also appeared in an impressive array of publications, and she was also the presenter of a BBC podcast called The Bomb. Her work has been supported by several writing fellowships, and she has received honors such as winning the Plowshares Emerging Writers Contest and AWP Intro Award. Today, she will share some of her work and explore how storytelling can open new ways of understanding and maybe in responding to different environmental challenges. So please help me give Emily a warm welcome.
Is this on? You guys hear me? Cool. Thank you so much, Coco, for that introduction. And thank you all for being here. It's an honor. I've been coming to these when I can for the last year. So it's really fun to be here. I love sort of what an interdisciplinary scope that these lectures offer. And this semester, I'm excited to be teaching my first class that's cross-listed with environmental studies. It's called Writing the Climate Crisis. So I have a few students here, which is great. So in some ways, this is like, this is the question that I'm kind of obsessed with. How do we write in these times? Not just what is effective, but yes, what will help us navigate? I think effective maybe is too narrow of a word in some ways, and we can talk more about that. So I'll just jump right in. In May 2024, The Guardian ran an article headlined, "Hopeless and Broken, Why the World's Top Climate Scientists Are in Despair." They'd surveyed hundreds of top climate scientists drawn from the lead authors and review editors of the IPCC reports. And the results were pretty grim. They found that 80% believed that we'd see at least 2.5 degrees Celsius of temperature rise, and nearly half anticipated almost 3 degrees Celsius. Only a small fraction, 6%, thought that we might reach the 1.5 degree target set by the Paris Climate Accords. So yeah, it's hard news to take in. And I will say it wasn't necessarily that the scientists thought it was technically impossible, but that there was not any signs of political will to move us there quickly enough. And these scientists were envisioning dystopian futures that probably some of us have encountered and grappled with before. Extreme weather, famines, mass migration, resource scarcity conflicts. But what was more startling about this article and what kind of stirred up some reactions was that The Guardian also asked what it was to be a human doing this work, holding this kind of intimate knowledge as your day job, trying to communicate it and not being listened to. And so they expressed their fear, their guilt, their distress and fury and despair. And we're not really used to hearing scientists talk that way all the time. So, they said things like, "We live in an age of fools, hopeless and broken. I worry about the future. I think it's just for my children." So it was quite an emotional article, and it caught my attention. Interestingly, or troublingly, some of the scientists who spoke to The Guardian were later mocked and dismissed by some of their fellow climate scientists, said that they were not being objective, that they were spreading alarmism. So in October of that same year, 3 of them published a comment in Nature, the journal, that read, "Scientists have emotional responses to climate change too." And they wrote about the importance of emotions as a source of motivation for their work. They pushed back on this idea that science and society are separate. And they also pointed out that some of the opposition was coming from people who were relatively protected in privileged positions and not on the front lines of climate change towards people who were. And they also brought up an interesting framework in that note, which is that some of this pushback was indicative of this rift we see in the community of people who care about climate change and want to address it, between this idea of like alarmism and doomism and solutionism and techno-optimism, that there's this sort of rift. And a lot of this comes from, very understandable anxieties about like what will work, what will move action, what will get people to believe, right? This is really understandable. It also, it's more complicated. It's also driven by where you are, the world you see, politics, money, what kind of post-carbon future you're envisioning. And of course, these terms are reductive, right? Many of us who care probably sometimes feel despair and sometimes feel hope and sometimes, want to feel like we need to highlight the solutions and the good work that people are doing, but that lives alongside fear, right? And I do want to say, and all of these people, right, are, many, I think, who are trying to communicate about climate change also maybe feel despair about the fact that whatever path they're choosing, it's not breaking through in the way that we would hope. And this isn't, I'm not blaming scientists, climate scientists at all. Like they're up against a lot, misinformation, corporate interests, politics, etc. So spoiler alert, I don't know the answer. I don't know like how to fix this. But I definitely don't think that like sort of policing the emotions of scientists and like restricting the kinds of stories and framings that are told by the people who know this the most is going to get us anywhere useful. So Dugald Hine is an English thinker and writer who has for decades collaborated with artists and activists and performers. He's maybe most known for co-founding something called, I see some smiles from my students who recognize this name, the Dark Mountain Project in 2009, which is a collective of artists and writers who were sort of questioning narratives of progress and technological solutions to climate change and calling for new stories to address these times. So in his latest book called At Work in the Ruins, Finding Our Place in the Time of Climate Change, Pandemics, and All, in trouble by relying too much on science to tell the entire story of climate change. Now, let me be clear. He is not questioning the science. He is very respectful of the science. But he's saying we've given science a particular role in society that is limiting the way that we can communicate and respond. He says that relying on science to tell the entire story can actually lead to apathy, to misguided solutions, and even the proliferation of alternative facts. So he writes, science is synonymous with knowledge, yet the facts that it provides, the models and probabilities and projections, fall short of what it takes to know a thing like climate change. And here, he's kind of speaking to knowing a thing is also knowing in our bodies and in our hearts what it feels like, how we're navigating, right? It's more complicated than facts and numbers. He goes on that same page to say, any way of knowing climate change that does not have a sense of vulnerability woven in is in danger of becoming a way of not knowing climate change. So long as the facts are held at arm's length, they don't touch us and we remain unchanged, right? So if we only speak through the numbers, then how are we moved? And then later, he sort of broadens it into a more structural critique. What's missing here is a sense that the truth might exceed the facts, that to tell the truth about climate change requires us to speak not only to the part of the story which the work of climate science reveals, but also to the questions which lie beyond the frame of science. And so again, it's not casting out science, but it's saying there's multiple questions that come into play here, right? So these are questions about culture, power, politics, justice, and emotions. Questions that are about how we got here and where we go from here. So yes, we need to stop burning fossil fuels, scale up sustainable energy, but how we implement those changes really gets into a tangled mess of questions about power and priorities, and crucially, what does the post-carbon future look like? What are we even imagining? And if we're imagining different things, we're going to have different answers. So we just can't ask science to do all of the work. It's doing so much already. And so you know, I'm thinking about like facts is one kind of truth. And there are other things that are true, but are not always as clear cut as a number, right? So I'm going to back up and now talk a little bit about my work, and then we'll come back to climate, my work which intersects with environment, but to try to give you an example of what I'm talking about here. So I'm interested in thinking about how different kinds of truth and knowledge can open ways to talk about stories that wind up being, that are complex, as climate change and many things are. And so what do I mean? I mean, what happens when we put myth in conversation with science, personal memory with documented history, the imagined beside the reported, and the imagined, you know, transparently imagined, right? I'm not, again, like I'm not arguing for a squishiness of truth. Like, I'm very committed to fact and transparency. But I'm interested in like flexibility of form and interdisciplinarity, and what does that allow? I think that there's an opportunity there to approach places where we have uncertainty and contradictory truths. So my book, Half-Life of a Secret, as was already sort of introed a little bit, it traces my journey to reckon with the legacy of my grandfather's work building nuclear weapons. He died before I was born, and so this was largely a project of reconstruction. To tell in this story, I started in the personal, drew on family memory, but had to bring in history, science, archival research, and direct reportage. So I started small and kind of spiraled out to look at these layers of psychological, sociological, environmental, historical, and global legacies of nuclear weapons. This meant I went to Hiroshima and I spoke to atomic bomb survivors. I toured the Nevada test site. I pored over environmental reports and public health studies, filed FOIA requests, interviewed activists, scientists, government officials, sick workers, etc. So to give a little more context, in 1943, my grandfather moved to Oak Ridge, Tennessee. This is a map of the area, I think from maybe the 50s or 60s, for a brand new secret town that was built for the sole purpose of enriching uranium for the first atomic bomb. So it held not only the weapons plants, but schools and grocery stores and hospitals and all the people, the nurses, the secretaries, the children, the shopkeepers that were needed to sustain what at the height of production was a population of 75,000 people. That were all contributing in some way to enriching uranium that would be bound for the Hiroshima bomb. It wasn't listed on area maps at the time, so this is not a World War II era map because it needed to stay secret. And the vast majority, like an estimated 95%, didn't know what they were doing. They knew they had a war job, right? And this policy was called compartmentalization, right? So you only know exactly what you need to know to complete your job. You file the paperwork, you tighten the knob, you check the pipes, etc. And so higher up, you knew a little bit more. So my grandfather, as a mid-level chemist, again, I couldn't ask him, but by my best guess, would have known he was working with uranium. That was important. Wouldn't have been briefed on the whole project by any means, but might have been able to make some guesses based on what he knew about the science at the time. So it was a patriotic time, and people were glad to earn good wages and contribute to the war effort, understandably. They learned what they were doing wildly when Truman announced the bombing of Hiroshima over the radio, like along with the rest of the world, in the middle of their workdays, right? It's, you know, and people poured out and celebrated the end of the war. So this is a story about history, but it's also a story about the stories that history doesn't tell. This is a real sign, billboard from World War II era Oak Ridge. What you see here, what you do here, what you hear here, when you leave here, let it stay here. So writing about events, right, that have been both sort of officially repressed, but also culturally sanitized, which I can talk a little bit more about later. There was a lot of contending with fragments, gaps, doubts, contradictions, unreliable memories, redacted documents, partial records, et cetera, and trying to make sense of all of these. So I had to get as far as I could for what I knew for sure. But then I also had to navigate the uncertainty and think about what do we learn from what's absent, from the erased data, from what is misremembered, in some cases, my own memories that were unreliable that I then through research found out they were unreliable, but what kind of information does my mismemory give me about the emotional reality? And what do we learn about ourselves and how secrecy operates and who's invested in keeping it that way? So this then became a story about secrecy. General Leslie Groves was the military head of Manhattan Project, and this is what he said about compartmentalization later in his memoir. Adherence to this rule not only provided an adequate measure of security, but it greatly improved overall efficiency by making our people stick to their knitting. We won't unpack there the sort of like misogyny there, but I think it's kind of interesting. I began to understand secrecy then, not just as something that covers up violence, but something that enables it on the most intimate and global scales. So during the war, compartmentalization disempowered workers, separated them from a sense of responsibility and numbed conscience. If anyone's seen the movie Oppenheimer, we see compartmentalization dramatized when a group of scientists approach him, asking him to sign a petition that's against using the bomb on Japan because Germany has already been defeated. They know Japan doesn't have a bomb. They don't think it's a moral thing to do. And he says, no, that's politics. That's not our job. So basically, you know, he wants them to stick to their knitting. And later he did become more politically active, but at that moment he was pushing back on that. So right, that's the line of compartmentalization. Scientists should stick to science and shouldn't engage in politics or ask about the social implications of their work. That's someone else's job to make those calls. So most obviously, right, we see compartmentalization enabling the horrors of nuclear weapons. The psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton coined the term psychic numbing to talk about this phenomena, describing the psychological response of atomic bomb survivors to overwhelming trauma. But later, interestingly, he extended that to the bomb makers themselves and to the American public at large, arguing that we'd had a sort of collective psychic numbing because to really acknowledge the true horrors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki would have been intolerable to our sense of ourselves, our sense of the country, and crucially, maybe to the continued production of nuclear weapons. So after the war, compartmentalization becomes further entrenched in the nuclear weapons industry and in Oak Ridge, and really internalized into the culture at large. So that really damages accountability and transparency. This is a view of Y-12, which is the weapons plant where my grandfather worked. This is a postcard. So I don't know if your workplace gives you a postcard like that, maybe ask them why. They need to emphasize how safe it is. So what I hadn't expected when I started this research was that compartmentalization also harmed Oak Ridge. But I did along the way learn that in the sort of the Cold War frenzy of the 1950s and 60s, Hundreds of thousands of pounds of mercury had been released into the local waterways, into the airways. It was in the soil, it was everywhere. And this was under the watch of my grandfather and men like him. It was because of a variety of reasons, rushed practices, inadequate safety measures justified under sort of this what they called necessary urgency against the Soviets. And it was well known at the time. Workers were waiting in rooms described as up to their boot tops in mercury, right? This wasn't like a subtle problem. And yet it was deliberately hidden from the public. That was possible because of this strict secrecy around the work and this culture of sort of not asking. This changed in the early 1980s and led to revelations about other toxic sources of radiological and toxic contamination that went back to World War II. Oak Ridge was designated as a Superfund site in 1989, which kicked off a period of activism and public health studies that sort of lasted into the early 2000s. So these are just a sampling of news reports, health studies. There's a congressional hearing. So this was a pretty difficult story to get my head around. I poured over thousands of pages of environmental reports and public health studies. And sort of troublingly, there's not a totally clear picture. So it's very easy definitively, Oak Ridge was contaminated, widespread complex contamination. There's still a very complex Superfund site. And yes, that contamination was hidden from the public view. But tracing sort of like the harm to public health becomes like pretty complicated. This is due to decades of lost and suppressed data or poor data keeping practices, due to a relatively small sample size of the community. So it's hard to prove statistical significance. Political and economic pressures that did influence the public health studies and sought to downplay harm in the final reports, and the just real scientific difficulty of proving a connection between a given health effect and a particular exposure. So while I went in wanting to say something really definitive about environmental contamination in Oak Ridge, no set of data could capture the whole story. So there was just a big difference between sort of what these official numbers could tell us, which themselves were only sort of one reflection of the science, which was a lot of maybe, a lot of what if, and how they reflected people's lived realities. So, whether you're sick or healthy, people who'd worked more dangerous blue-collar jobs had one view, whereas people who'd worked safer management positions and got paid more had another view. Activists and whistleblowers versus people who were very proud of the city's history and very invested in this identity of this patriotic city that their view had helped win World War II. And it didn't always fall along the expected fault lines. So there's a neighborhood that's adjacent to Y-12, the weapons plant, called Scarborough. It's a historically Black neighborhood that was put there for racism. And there was understandably a lot of concern and attention around the potential contamination of Scarborough. It got a lot of media attention, a lot of focus of these studies and monitoring. But some residents at some point questioned whether some residents of Scarborough, Black residents who are very committed to their neighborhood, whether that attention was warranted. And they pointed out, that there were studies of prevailing wind patterns that showed that some of the airborne contamination may have been deposited more heavily elsewhere. There's, a ridge between the neighborhood and the plant. They pointed out sort of sloppy media reporting that, said that a certain creek had skirted, that went right through their neighborhood, but actually skirted the edge and was actually more directly in contact with other neighborhoods, right? So there was this sort of rush, in their view, so much concern about Scarborough that it was actually sort of painting a picture that was psychologically dangerous to the people there that wasn't necessarily warranted. And even the EPA wanted there to be more sampling comparing Scarborough to other areas, and that didn't happen. So you get fault lines that aren't maybe what you expected. So this was these three members of the community who had all been in very scientific and technical positions wrote an op-ed in the Oak Ridger, the local paper, in 1998 that said, we would like those interested in helping our neighborhood with health and contamination issues to be mindful of the psychological, sociological, and economic consequences that can result whether contamination issues are real or imaginary. So just, there are things that the science can and should tell us about Oak Ridge, but it just doesn't capture the political and emotional realities of living in such a place. So despite my desire for definitiveness, this story would remain unresolved. I'm just gonna, oh, is it 12:30? Is that the time? Okay. I was gonna read a little bit, but I think I'll skip it, but I'll just maybe read one line. Or actually, this is the line. Oops. Oh, you can't maybe read it. So I wrote, it comes to down to a kind of faith in the body, in the numbers, in the institutions meant to protect us. So there's a weird sound, right? Oh, I think it's my mic. What if I put it here? Will this? Yeah? Is it still on?
Yeah, it's on.
Okay, but I don't want it on my notes. What about there? Yeah? Okay. Right, so the way people process this just had to do with a lot of complex factors. Someone who was really valuable who I spoke to was a man named Owen Hoffman, who is an expert in environmental risk exposure and also a longtime resident of Oak Ridge. And he had participated in some of these health studies. And he had a really nuanced understanding. So he was really critical of the ways that final assessments had downplayed risk and harm that were based, in his view, on financial, economic, and political pressures. And he thought that among some sick workers and activists and residents, there had become an inflated sense of harm. And that to him weren't backed by the evidence he'd seen. And he helped me understand that there's both a danger in understating harm and a danger in overstating it. He was really angry. He felt that the way these studies were conducted and the way all this was handled was a missed opportunity to use accountability and transparency to begin to unravel some of the insidious secrecy that had been built into the fabric of Oak Ridge. So he said to me, the shroud of secrecy associated with Y12 operations feeds public distrust and speculations that lead to a personal belief about the relationships between contamination and disease. Integrity of information is everything. If you can't trust the information, how can you function as a democracy? So here we see a process of compartmentalization that began long ago to separate questions of science from questions of politics and conscience and feeling came home to roost and fed this mistrust in science and this damaging to democracy. And so to tell these stories, I had to knit back these threads. So in many ways in my work, I'm trying to do that, to write against compartmentalization and put different things together to sort of tell a truth that can include all of them. Let's see. I feel like I'm going longer than I thought I would be at this point. Okay, so return to climate change. Times are dire. Has anyone heard of the doomsday clock? Yes, some hands. Okay, so the doomsday clock, if you haven't heard, was started by Manhattan Project scientists, former Manhattan Project scientists after the war, who wanted to communicate the threat of nuclear weapons to the public. It's an interesting scientific tool, right? Because it is a metaphor, right? It's people trying to communicate through metaphor and deciding that sort of that maybe this is a kind of storytelling that will move people. Now, interestingly, and they were also pushing back against compartmentalization, right? They were scientists who were like, we are trying to speak politically and influence policy. Now they now also take climate change, disruptive technologies, and bio risks into account. And the clock is now set at 89 seconds to midnight, which is the closest it's ever been, including at the height of the Cold War. So that's like kind of scary. Again, this is a subjective judgment of a group of people. And you can decide, you can think about whether or not this is an effective means of communication. But I've spent, I'm wrapping up a story about the doomsday clock, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about this tension between quantifiability and uncertainty, and what are the opportunities for it, and what is the good of it. So one of the people I spoke to a lot of the people who set the doomsday clock. One of them is a man named Robert Sokolow, who is a climate scientist and Princeton emeritus professor. And I asked him, why sort of have they get criticized for this sometimes, right? That it is just this metaphor. Like why should you have this sort of qualitative metaphor? And he argued that there is a real danger in over-quantifying and collapsing social, ethical, and philosophical considerations into numbers that are essentially political tools. And he used the social cost of carbon as an example. So I'm sure some people are familiar with the social cost of carbon, but it's basically a dollar value that's put to the financial damage due to climate change that combines factors such as property damage, lost agricultural productivity, health costs, lost human lives, right? So there's a value if you want to convince people to invest in climate change, to say, look, it will cost money not to, right? Or in climate action or in reducing CO2. But it's also a political tool. And so we can see that with Obama, it was set at one number, it went down with Trump, it went further up with Biden, and then down again. And then it's been erased by Trump. But within that, there are troubling questions and assumptions that are buried in the even idea of calculating a social cost of carbon, such as how do you value a human life? Sort of controversially, Biden's number had a higher value on human life for people from rich countries than people from poor countries. Now, this was justified sort of having to do with like per capita income, but it's unsettling, right? It's unsettling to put a number to a life. And it raises questions of whose life count, and how do you weigh the life of a human being now versus the present, versus the future. So Rob Sokolow said to me, you can have a number, but you have no right answer. And so back up a minute and say, is it productive to ask the question you're asking? Okay, so I'm gonna, sort of skip ahead a little bit, but I spent months sort of talking to these people who set the doomsday clock, trying to understand their motivations, their struggles, how it's set behind the scenes, their own emotions around it. And stay tuned if you want to read that story. It'll be out with Popular Mechanics in their January-February issue. Okay, I think I'm actually going to skip. Oops. Okay. Okay. So this has opened up. I'm thinking a lot about time now, and like how do questions about how does the way that we inhabit and think about time like affect how we navigate the times that we're living in? What does it mean to sort of mark a beginning and ending? How does it help make things possible, or what are the dangers? And I'm not going to get way into this right now, but if people have questions, we can talk more. But these are a few of the clocks I'm looking at. This is the climate clock in Union Square. This is this thing called the Clock of the Long Now, which is built in the desert of Nevada, that's meant to keep time for 10,000 years. And it's being built and give people an experience of deep time and hopefully move them to consider how we might need to transform and this is just a really good book that's been informative to me. Okay, let's see. So I guess I want to leave time for questions. Maybe I'll just skip to. There are, scientists and other people who are also doing a lot of this work that to me is re-knitting and asking these questions that are outside of the frame of science, or pushing back on the idea that the stories and the authority should come from just one source. One of them is Kate Marble, the climate scientist, and this book, Human Nature, just came out earlier this year. So she wrote, this is in the introduction after a passage about anger, guilt, sadness, and fear. She writes, "Isn't this scientific? Aren't researchers supposed to be perfectly objective, unemotional, and neutral about the world we study? I can't be. I need to declare a conflict of interest regarding Earth. Everyone I love lives here. But I do worry that by saying this, I'll leave myself vulnerable to attack, maybe even undermine climate science more broadly. I can imagine plenty of bad actors claiming that my humanity clouds my judgment. I'm also aware that I live in a culture that has words for emotional women, none of which are compliments. Still, I'm a scientist at heart, which means I always want more data. I haven't been trained to ignore things this important. So I think we should be as honest about observing and documenting our emotions as we are about measuring rainfall or soil moisture. Perhaps we feel nothing, pretending we feel nothing about our changing world doesn't make us objective, it makes us liars." So I really love the way she's making a scientific argument about emotions as evidence too, as a kind of data, which is really sort of what I've been arguing for more broadly, that stories that bring in different kinds of data that don't always go in the same place together can be powerful and are actually really necessary right now. Stories that decenter the human, that teach us about our interconnectedness with each other in the living world, that hold space for grief, and that expand our sense of what's possible. And okay, I'm just gonna backtrack here. Has anyone heard of Joanna Macy? Oh, the two people in my class. Oh, I'm shocked, in a room full of environmental studies people. Okay, delighted to introduce you. So Joanna Macy is, she died a few months ago at age 96, but she was an environmental activist, a Buddhist scholar, a Rilke translator, a systems thinker, and sort of was really passionate about the need in activist spaces to create space for feeling, and arguing that that was actually political. So she wrote, "The refusal to feel takes a heavy toll. Not only is there an impoverishment of our emotional and sensory life, flowers are dimmer and less fragrant, our loves less ecstatic, but this psychic numbing also impedes our capacity to process and respond to information. The energy expended in pushing down despair is diverted from more creative uses, depleting the resilience and imagination needed for fresh visions and strategies." And she would use a systems theory lens to talk about this. So she would describe emotions as a feedback loop that help us understand how to respond to our world. So if we cut off that feedback loop, we are losing that, maybe evidence or data, in the words of Kate Marble. Back, I think in May, Trump cut funding from climate change research at Princeton, which is not surprising, and that's it was just one other cut, right, in a barrage of them. But what was interesting is that he cited climate anxiety in children as the reason. That really caught my eye. So climate anxiety is a big problem, as this study from the Lancet that was published, I think, in 2021, found that it was an international study of 10,000 young people. And it really is a critical problem for young people. But what the authors found, that it wasn't even climate change that was the real cause. It was lack of government action and feeling betrayed by adults. And as we know, one Swedish teenager, right, protesting ignited a global youth climate movement, right? There is power in emotions, and as Jonah Macy would argue, the people who are invested in keeping our emotions down are invested in the status quo. So emotions are dangerous to those in the status quo. So let's let them come back, I guess. And then I'll just end on, these are like a bunch of other writers that I am drawing inspiration from and reading as I think through these questions. And that I will take questions.
Thank you, Emily. While people gather thoughts, I'll start us off with a comment and a question. I had to say, as a scientist, it really resonated with me when you were talking basically about our moral duty to share our feelings and yeah, because where do you know, traditionally we've been trained to just provide the facts and communicate them very well, but people are not typically trained to communicate like that. And I think as a result, I see a lot of scientists who are, even if they wanted to, they are plainly uncomfortable to discuss their work beyond the numbers.
Yeah.
So that's the comment. I don't know what the question would be. How do you, what kind of training do we need to be able to talk about our research beyond the numbers? But that's not my question.
Okay. Well, can I just say one thing?
Yes.
I guess I wouldn't even necessarily say, like, it can't be everyone's job to tell every kind of story.
Yes.
So sometimes maybe this means like working with artists and other people, right? To expand the story. And also, I think what I found so disturbing about the Guardian thing is, yeah, not everyone has to speak about their emotions, but do we have to attack the people who are, right? Like that's kind of a problem when scientists themselves are policing each other.
Yeah,
Those stories.
it's complicated.
Yeah, for sure.
And
Yeah.
I personally don't have an answer.
Yeah.
But it's a very interesting question to think about. My real question is about the stories. Maybe you can comment about how you do this in your own work, because you are walking a fine line between emotion and facts. So how do you decide whose story to tell so that you can present a compelling story without losing, to present as unbiased point, I guess.
Yeah. Okay, so bias and subjectivity and objectivity is something that I talk a lot about in my classes, especially my journalism class. And so it's something that you have to navigate differently in every piece, and in every story it's going to be different. But sort of a short answer is for me, it's transparency. It's being transparent. Like an article for AP or Reuters like reads very differently from a reported personal essay or a deeply researched memoir. So those have different roles, and both are really important. In much of the kind of writing I do, there is a personally grounded voice, and I'm trying to be really transparent about where I'm coming from. I'm trying to do my due diligence about, you don't just quote anybody, right? There's old, journalist saying of, if one person says it's raining and one person says it's not, you don't quote two, you go outside and see if it's raining, right? So you verify everything that you can. And you think about questions of power and what your blind spots are. Certainly, I ran into a lot of things that I was surprised by in my research about the environmental contamination in Oak Ridge. I mean, the contamination itself, I didn't know very much about, which is wild, having spent a lot of time in the area visiting my grandmother, because it's not sort of particularly advertised. But like the sort of the complication with Scarborough and the ways that different communities, I kind of went in there being like, yes, it's a story of environmental justice. And it's not a story of environmental justice. But I found out that it was more complicated than that. So I guess I just say, like, it's about transparency, it's about digging, it's about being clear. If you're quoting someone or sharing something that you can't verify it, sort of what, like, what is the value or authority of each kind of knowledge that you're including, and being clear that that's true. And I often tell my students that the best journalism is when you are surprised by what you find, when you go in with one thesis and you turn out to be wrong. So,
thank you very much.
yeah.
How do you feel that AI has changed the extent to which people are willing to share emotion and feelings through their writing?
Wow. Okay. Funny because we're talking about
Yeah.
AI later in class today, Diana. I don't have an answer, but maybe you'll tell me what you think later in class. I guess I am interested that like people are using AI as therapists these days. So like, I don't know, I have no clue, but I'm a little bit scared about the idea that that machines are affecting how we're processing and understanding our own emotions. That seems dangerous. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Emily. Really interesting talk. I'm excited to read the book. Caleb Scoville, assistant professor in sociology. I'm curious how you're thinking about the relationship between like stories and narratives and complexity or simplicity. I do a lot of work on sort of media portrayals of climate change, and one of the things that it seems to me that we're up against is very simple stories. And I worry about I mean I write really complex stories in my work.
Yeah.
And I guess I wonder like where is the writer's role in sort of simplification versus complexity? Like how do you think about those trade-offs and what fora you're in and what kinds of interventions you're trying to make? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a super good question that I probably will always be navigating. So I don't have a definitive answer. And again, want to be clear that like a news article is different from most of the writing that I'm doing. And so there are times when just like staying very straightforward and simple may be the way to do it. I do think sometimes we can underestimate people and the complexity that maybe they can understand. And like, in the case of, I encountered where there's people who are sick and attribute their illness to environmental exposures and have been told that that's not true. And again, I can't say, like, it's a really complicated picture, so I'm not trying to say one way or the other. But feeling patronized and their concerns dismissed, despite the fact that there was contamination, that there were decades of government cover-up, certainly didn't help them trust doctors or scientists, right? So I don't know, some of this may even like step beyond the role of like just the writer, but like the sort of on the ground communicator, like whether you're a doctor or you're a journalist interviewing people, like taking time to really listen to the complexity of people's lives. And most people are sort of more complex than we give them credit for. And maybe they can understand our own complexity if we take the time to accept theirs. I hope. Yeah, thanks.
Other questions?
Thank you so much for sharing your work. I've been very struck by the way that you weave in your, personal narrative, family history, and this kind of deep research of your grandfathers. And how, I guess, do you balance that attention or that search for family histories versus this larger kind of structural critique that you're also making in your book? And I guess when does that shift start to happen in your creative process? Like when do you start shifting from writing about like the possible histories of your grandpa versus how this is impacting our collective life. Yeah, and how do you, yeah, I guess how do you hold readers through that kind of the intimate, vulnerable kind of personal histories and the more kind of collective? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for that question. I mean, I will say with that book, and again, different for every project, but for that book, I was really clear that I actually didn't want it to be really about my family. Like, my greatest hope was that my family was a way for people to think about their own positions in families. So like, okay, I happen to have like an interesting backstory that I could grab onto. But everyone kind of does, you know, and we're all, like, I deeply believe the personal is political. And so when I started this, and actually the seed of the idea actually came when I was a senior in college. And I remembered this photograph of my grandfather standing in front of a nuclear test blast that had hung in my grandmother's house. And I just started to be haunted by this image. And I was like, wait, what was that? Like, what? That's so weird. What does that mean? You know, and I'd like gone to a Quaker school, right? Like I was raised in a kind of pacifist household. Like, this didn't make any sense to me, that this wasn't something we talked about or contended with. And so it was always about this tension, you know, between, okay, here's this thing that like literally I saw before I like went to sleep as a child visiting my grandmother, but that it connects to this like really huge, devastating violence that I don't want to be a part of. And it was never separate. Interestingly, on the note of like unreliable memory, right? It turns out that I couldn't find that picture. And I mean, a little bit of a spoiler, but well, maybe not. The search for like whether or not it was actually real. My grandfather's role was real, and he did visit nuclear tests. Like, I was able to verify that. Whether or not that picture actually existed became a question that I was tracing throughout the book. But I guess the personal was the way in for me. And it certainly mattered. But it mattered to me more in the larger sense of like, what do we learn about, I guess, what do we learn about our interconnectedness when we can connect the personal to the political? Like, I was also tracing my grandfather's mental illness, and I didn't get into this, but he was bipolar and alcoholic, and that was another sort of layer of secrecy within the family. And so sort of thinking about how are these harms intersecting? You know, how does compartmentalization and psychic numbing like also hurt the one who's doing it, you know? And maybe because I hope, like, if we can understand that having nuclear bombs, building nuclear bombs, like, can cause great violence over there, if we can understand that that also causes violence to ourselves, maybe that helps us imagine a world in which our safety doesn't depend on weapons of such destruction.
Okay, we're going to leave it at that so we can announce the winner of the raffle. But before we do that, let's give Professor Strasser a big round of applause for a great talk.